Well, good morning, everybody. So I want to start with a question this morning, and by a show of hands, I'd love to see how many of you out there consider yourself a DIYer, a do-it-yourself person with projects. And really, it's honestly more than I expected from this, point of view. I am convinced that it was my father who gave me the courage and the encouragement to become a DIYer. I still remember my first project that he encouraged me to do. He wanted me to tear apart our non-working lawnmower and see if I could figure out what was wrong with it. Simple little push mower, right? No big deal. Except I was 12, and I had never touched a wrench to an engine in my life. And so I started working on this, and the motor was just a mystery to me. And it was one I wouldn't solve that day. Still remember that one bolt. The one bolt on the underside of the mower that held the top part of the engine to the bottom, that when I took it loose and pulled a little bit, created this weird sound of all of the gears in the gearbox tumbling to the bottom in no certain order. I was mortified. This thing was already a horrible failure in my mind. And so I did what any of you would do as well. I'm confident of this. Please don't take this away from me. I put that one bolt back in. I bolted the engine back to the body of the push mower, pushed it off to the side as though I'd never touched it. And oddly enough, it wasn't until I was in my 40s that I had the courage to ask my dad, "Do you remember that mower?" He goes, "Yeah, the one you took apart and never fixed?" Yep, that was the one, Dad, thanks. I continued to encourage to risk in all these DIY projects through the years because my dad encouraged me. It was you can do this, you can figure this out, you screw it up, we'll fix it, don't worry about it. And so today, I am not afraid to tackle remodeling projects on our home. Not afraid to jump into drywall or electrical or plumbing problems when we encounter them. In fact, there's very few problems that I'm not willing to jump into and try to solve. My courage has grown over the years, I have to admit, right alongside the growth of Pinterest and YouTube. Those have contributed greatly. I mention all that to say that I think some of us are guilty of turning our relationship with God into a DIY project. We have that philosophy. When we encounter a problem, when we hit an issue in life, we consider it a problem to be solved. And so we lean into the Bible as God's instruction manual for how to live this life. We dig through it for principles that can be applied to our specific situation because we're convinced if I have the right information, I can fix anything. That isn't the way God intended us to relate to Him or to His Word. And that approach puts us at the center of our universe and fundamentally changes our relationship with God. We started last Sunday, for those of you who weren't here last week, we started this new series that is going to help us reimagine how we relate to God. And in it, we're going to look first at 4 postures we take in our relationship with God that we choose and why each one of those is so appealing. And then at the last Sunday in this series, we're going to take a look at how the Bible describes a healthy, growing relationship with God. We're going to look at these first 4 because I think in each one of them there are pieces. We might not live in one of these, but there are pieces in it that can slip into our lives and begin to impact, ultimately, the relationship that God wants to have with us. So last week, we took a look at life under God. And basically, all of these come from, let me back up a second, all of these come from a common point, and they can lead us to a dangerous place in our relationship with God. They come from this common point of us recognizing that there is danger and chaos in our world. And there is. And that all of that is uncontrollable, it feels, so we get afraid. And based on that fear, we seek some method to control situations in our life, to control what this danger ultimately means for us and for our family and friends. Every one of the postures has a common starting point and seeks a solution to this danger, fear, control cycle that we get locked into For example, last week we talked about life under God. And this graphic illustrates it, because what we're trying to do then is ultimately control God. We're trying to control Him through our religion, through our rituals, through our morality, so that we put God in our debt, and God will ultimately then control the chaos that's in our world specifically. Big question is, with that posture, how good is good enough? How good do we have to be to put God in our debt? This morning, we're going to look at a life over God. This particular posture dismisses all of that stuff under life under God, all those rituals, all that morality, as irrational superstition. In its simplest form, a life over God works like this. God has created the universe with certain knowable and immutable laws, like laws of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of mathematics, the laws of how the toilet paper roll is supposed to go on the holder. Unchangeable. Our task in life is to discover these laws and translate them into principles we can apply to everyday life. A life over God, if you look at the graphic, basically cuts God out of the equation. It eliminates the middleman and tries to gain control over our world ourselves. The sinister shortcoming of this life over God is that it creates a formulaic faith in us. If you do a quick search on Amazon, you'll find thousands of Christian self-help books that try to teach formulas like this. They'll teach you 5 steps to a godly marriage, or 6 laws of biblical leadership. There's actually a popular book on Amazon right now by a woman who wrote the book, entitled it Jesus as CEO, as if what Jesus came to establish was a large corporation and run it, and we can learn from his examples. You can find 5 ways to manage your finances, God's way. All of these books espouse they've got principles that they've discovered in Scripture that if you implement them, they will work flawlessly. And what's interesting is many of these books, if you want to implement their principles, often don't require a relationship with God. And that's what He wants most for us. They're simply filled with proven formulas that help you get control of an out-of-control area in your life. And though it's not their intent, these authors begin to teach that God can be set aside. He doesn't need to be involved for these principles to be put into practice. Nobody will write that, but that's what's behind these steps. God may be praised, God may be thanked, God may be worshiped for giving us wise precepts for life, but He doesn't need to be an active participant in our everyday life. That's optional. These books, these messages are often appealing to us because working through principles, it's a little more predictable and manageable than an actual relationship with God. Any relationship, human or divine, can be messy, time-consuming, and often uncontrollable. While principles, in and of themselves, are clinical and comprehensive. And so we lean into those. The Bible gives us some glimpses in various characters' lives of how this can drift into and how we can drift into this pattern of relating to God. One of my favorites is Moses in the Old Testament. Moses became the leader of the nation of Israel after they had been slaves in Egypt for more than 400 years. Multiple generations had passed. And hearing his people's cries for help, God sent Moses, a reformed ex-offender turned rancher. And he was sent to rescue Israel. From the beginning, Moses' story demonstrates to us the power of God in his life. And it shows up in some interesting ways, most often through this staff that Moses had gotten comfortable carrying for 40 years in the desert, as he was tending his sheep and his cattle. Moses got into this magic contest with Pharaoh's magicians, and at God's command threw that staff on the ground, and it turned into a snake and ate all the other snakes that they had created. Moses lifted his staff every time he brought down a plague on Egypt. In fact, at one point, he touched that staff to the Nile River, and it turned to blood. When the entire nation of Israel faced annihilation at the hands of Pharaoh's army, Moses lifted that staff and parted the seas so that the Israelites could escape annihilation by walking through on a completely dry seabed. But getting out of Egypt, that was only part of the Israelite story. It was only part of Moses' leadership. On their way to the promised land, the Israelites would become disobedient and they would wander in the desert for 40 years. 40 years facing significant challenges, not the least of which is finding water in a desert. And so in Exodus 17, you find the people coming to Moses, and they are complaining and blaming. Both God and Moses are at fault here, they say, about how hot and dry and uncomfortable it is to travel in the desert. Note to any of you heading out on vacations, it is hot and dry in the desert. If you're planning a trip to the desert with your family and your dog in the minivan, this is your chance to reconsider. So God tells Moses to get all the people together. Gather the leaders in front of this rock and strike the rock. And water will come out of it for the people to drink. And so Moses obeys, gathers them all, strikes the rock, and enough water flows out of that rock to hydrate the entire nation of Israel, which numbered about 1 million people at that point, and all their livestock. It's a pretty impressive miracle, right? And as he had done so many times before, Moses again in Numbers 20 turns to God. The people again are angry at him for leading them to a place that's evil and horribly dry and has no food. They literally say to Moses at this point, "We had it better in Egypt as slaves than we do living in the desert." I think that's a little hyperbole on their part. So Moses turns to God for help. God tells Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together." Now notice the difference here. He says to Moses, "Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water." But something happens to Moses between this conversation with God about speaking to the rock and gathering the people together in front of the rock. The Bible says Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence just as he commanded him, and he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of this rock?" And that "we" is referring to him and Aaron. God's been cut out of the equation. "Must we bring water out of the rock every time you get thirsty?" Moses raised his arm, and he struck the rock twice with his staff. And water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. Rather than obeying God's command to speak to the rock, Moses struck the rock with his staff. He disobeyed God. Why? Let's look at the scene again. Moses was between a rock and a hard place. I couldn't resist. He had this furious mob of thirsty people yelling at him. They were ready to riot if he didn't solve the problem. He needed a guaranteed solution, something that would work, something he could count on, a way of supplying water that could not possibly fail. And so Moses turned to what had always worked in the past: his staff. His fear of the people who were out of control, his fear of the people who were presenting a danger to him in this situation, led Moses to disregard his relationship with God and put his trust in what he felt was a proven formula: take the staff, strike the rock. But Moses paid a high price for his disobedience, for allowing his fear to overshadow his faith in God. The Lord says to Moses and Aaron, "Because you didn't trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you won't bring this community into the land I give them." Moses had spent more than half of his life leading this nation, more than half of his life journeying towards the promised land. And instead, Moses will end up dying just within sight of entering. Moses' failure points out a lot of the shortcomings in a life over God posture. First, it reduces God to a reproducible formula. It assumes that the way God has worked in the past is how he'll continue to work in the future. That once we've discovered the principles that govern God's actions, we can employ them with guaranteed outcomes. God, you'll hear it when people begin to drift into this way of relating to God. They'll start to use phrases like, well, God only does, or God never does, or God always does. Used a lot by Christian communities everywhere, and they usually indicate that this life over God posture is present. I think the first time that I really encountered someone who believed this was in the 1980s. I was fresh out of college and working in a church in southern Indiana, and one of the pastors there had fallen in love with this ministry and this teacher, who oddly enough was from Hinsdale, Illinois. That's where his offices were based. And he wasn't the only one who loved this teacher. Over the years, hundreds of thousands of well-meaning Christians would attend these seminars and learn these principles from this man. And they were very appealing because he promised that he had the answers to the chaos spiritually that was coming into our country. He had the answers to the breakdown of the family that was happening. He had the answers to why kids were abandoning their faith in their teenage years. Now remember, this was the 1980s, not 2018. And I went and I listened to him for 3 days. And as I listened, I had this growing sense of discomfort rather than encouragement by what he was teaching. Every principle that he taught was couched with a similar guarantee. If you do these 3 things, then God is obligated to do this in your life. If you enact these 5 principles, then God has promised, and it's guaranteed, he will do this in your life. He projected absolute certainty to the audiences that listened to him that he had figured out how God operated, or at least how this world operated that God created for us. And rather than placing trust in God, throughout the whole seminar, I began to feel this sense that he was calling us to place our trust in the principles he had created and was teaching. I didn't know it then. It took a lot of time for me to wrestle through this. But those words fly in the face of what Jesus himself taught. They fly in the face of the writings of the rest of the New Testament writers, like Paul in Romans. When Paul says, how great are God's riches and his wisdom and his knowledge? How impossible is it for us to understand his decisions and his ways? Who can know the Lord's thoughts? Who knows enough to give God advice? And who's given him so much that God needs to pay it back? I didn't have words then, but I later saw this training in light of these verses, and it left me wondering if everything in the Christian life can be explained by a principle, by cause and effect in our human relationships, then why do we need God? Teaching like this marginalizes God's place in our lives or eliminates him altogether. Implementing God's principles and the outcomes, that work is left to us. That heavy load is put on our shoulders. And it leaves us with nowhere to turn when the outcomes are not what we expected. The second terrible shortcoming of this posture is that it does nothing to alleviate our fear. Instead, it saddles us with a degree of responsibility that we were never intended to carry. Listen to Jesus' words. Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I'm humble and gentle at heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke, it's easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light. It frees us to follow Jesus in this way. It frees us to have that relationship with him because it takes the responsibility off of us to solve all the problems in this life on our own. Life over God heaps more fear on us because we can't control our situation. We can't do this alone. God will put more on us than we're able to handle. Because we're not intended to do this without Him. It's with Him. The third big downfall of a life over God is that it causes us to measure our progress as a believer on the effective outcomes we achieve rather than our faithfulness to God. Think back to Moses striking that rock when God had said, "Speak to it." Was his methodology effective in Numbers 20? Absolutely. He struck the rock and massive amounts of water flowed. He was effective. From a human standpoint, he was a huge success. And the people may have praised Moses, but God wasn't impressed. It wasn't about his effectiveness. It was about his faithfulness to God, about his trust in God, about his love for God. That's what mattered. And in this case, it seems like God performed the miracle in spite of Moses, not because of him. And that's a caution to us that even when things are going well in our life, even when the principles seem to be working, we may have strayed far outside the boundaries of God's intention for a relationship with him. Ultimately, living a life over God can't deliver us from the cycles of fear and control that plague humanity. The promise is appealing, that we'd have a world where proven formulas guarantee a success of security. But that's a dream this posture can't deliver on. It's easy to gradually shift our focus in this walk with God. It's easy to shift our focus, even if it's unintentional, from following God to following guidelines that promise outcomes. But in so doing, we marginalize God's existence and relevance in our life, and our faith as a whole can become a DIY project. You know, all those DIY projects, I got a long list of them for this summer at home. All of those projects appeal to me because I like to see a problem and find a solution. I like to fix things. God's just wired me that way. Maybe he's wired you that way too. Ultimately, and unfortunately, I have this tendency to take that same skill set and apply it to my relationship with God, to all spiritual issues in my life. And that means that I can find myself drifting into this posture of a life over God that cuts him out, sets him off to the side, and I try to control all of this world that impacts me. All the while, God's not even in my thoughts or in my mind. When we fail to engage God in a relationship, every day, every moment in our ordinary life, it's as if we're saying to God, thank you for giving me these principles. I got it from here. I'm good. You've taught me. I don't need any more. And when we do that, just like Moses, we can end up with some disastrous consequences in our life. Because the only promise that a life over God can fulfill is that it will ultimately lead us to a life without God. And that means no life at all.